My name is Austin Wallington, and this is my fungal presentation for plant pathology. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about two fungal diseases in corn, rice, and wheat. The first one I decided to do was foliar diseases caused by ascomycetes and deuteromycetes. These are funguses that can cause mostly foliar damage to your crops, but if you don't control it well enough, it can lead to root rot or even grain or fruit damage. This is a disease that can be found in many different plants and row crops, but the ones I'm going to focus on in this presentation is corn and rice. There are many different types of this fungus out there that you can find in your crops, but the main one in corn and rice is cochleobolus. In corn, the main way you'll notice this is through southern leaf blight, and that's just the bacteria getting into your corn leaves by insect damage or anything like that. And once it's in your leaves, you'll notice that you'll have small tan lesions beginning on your corn leaves, and that could lead to lesions that could eventually cover the whole corn plant. And the life cycle of this fungus is it can overwinter in your plant debris, so it could, if you don't integrate it with tillage after harvest, you could have this problem again in the next year, because once spring hits, it produces spores that can be spread throughout your fields with wind and rain, and it could lead to even more damage than just the couple plants you had in the last season. Management for this is like many of the other cochleobolus fungi, and most of the time it can be cured with foliar applied fungicides. This is what you would see if you had southern corn leaf blight in your crops, and that would just be the effect of the fungus getting into your corn. Cochleobolus in rice. The main disease you'll see in rice is brown spot disease of rice. You'll mostly notice this on the leaves, but you can also see it on the glumes and the grains of the rice. You'll see this in the early stages, which is kind of the same in corn. It attacks the early leaves first and then just kind of moves on from there if it's not taken care of. The fungi has a way of making itself seen in rice by the yellowish brown spots along the leaves. Much like in corn, the best way for this would be a foliar herbicide or foliar fungicide, but in rice, another way that it enters the plants is through plants that have low nutrients. So you just want to make sure that you have plenty of nutrients supplied to your plants, and one of the main ones you'd want to watch for is silicon, because that's such a main ingredient in growing rice. And again, this would just be some of the signs of brown spot disease in your rice, just signs of that fungus in your field. Control of that would be one of the ways that most people will recommend is that you start with a resistant variety that is resistant against that fungus. And if you have a resistant seed variety, another way that I would recommend that you kind of compound your resistance is to use a fungicide seed treatment before you plant. And another thing, since this disease can overwinter in the plant debris, you'd want to integrate them into the soil with tillage after harvest so that you can choke off the fungus in your field. Another way is just to get recent soil tests and make sure that your plants have sufficient amounts of nutrients throughout the growing season, and just monitor that with soil tests throughout the growing season and things like that. The other fungus that I decided to do research on and present about was post-harvest diseases of plant products by ascomycetes and deuteromycetes. This is a disease that can affect any plants, but more often than not, you'll find it in plants with a more tender exterior, like a tomato or strawberries or pears or a lot more in your fruits. but it can have a big impact on your crops because you could lose up to 30% yield loss in that crop. And it's not just with tomatoes or peaches or things like that. You can also see it in corn and rice and wheat and soybeans. The main one that you'd see in many of your legumes and your cereal grains after harvest, which is when you'll see the effect of this in most of your grain, is aspergillus. And occasionally you'll see some fusarium toxins, but aspergillus is really the main one. Aspergillus fungus is one that you would not necessarily see while you still have the grain in the field, because it doesn't really present a huge showing of the disease through the growing season. But one way you could check it, because this is a disease that really affects the germination of the plant, so you could do germ counts throughout the field and just see what your percent germination is before harvest. And some other ways that you might see this in a cornfield in the late growing stages is that you might see some corn ear rot because it's attacking the grain filling stage, and just to watch during grain fill and things like that. This is what you would see if you had aspergillus in your fields in the form of corn ear rot. So the other one that I found was fusarium toxins, and this one is one that's most known because it's the cause of vomitoxin, which is also known as deoxynivalenol. This toxin is the main cause of gibberella ear rot and also a leading cause in head blight and wheat. This toxin is deadly in animal feed and can cause the animals to develop slow feeding habits and can eventually grow into animals just losing weight. And that's why it's one of the main things that you see people looking for, because if you go to a grain elevator and they take a sample of your corn or wheat or even rice and it has trace amounts of vomitoxin in it, you'll get docked for that because they don't want that in the grain that they're taking in. And one of the ways that you'd see vomitoxin and fusarium toxins in your wheat is right here. That would be like after harvest. And then some of the ways you could see it during harvest is like the heads of your wheat aren't as green as they should be, and there's like a brown tint to them. And this side is the wheat with no vomitoxin, and you can tell this severe difference with the vomitoxin in the wheat. The control of post-harvest diseases isn't as easy as it is for the foliar-applied diseases. It can't be cured with a fungicide, and there's not really a great way to know what it is and how it's getting in your, well, not how it's getting in your field, but when it's in your field. You notice this mostly at harvest, and the biggest thing that it affects the yield of is grain storage. You just need to monitor the moisture levels of your grain when you store it, because there's certain moisture levels that are too low for this fungus to grow and move throughout the grain. So you'd want to store it at a low enough moisture level to not have the grain, but also a good enough moisture level to still keep the quality of the grain. Also, you want to monitor the temperature in the bins that you're storing your grain, because this is a disease that I think it can't grow under 8 degrees Celsius. So you just want to monitor that, make sure that you store your grain in a cool place, and just monitor the temperature of that throughout. And lastly, and the most common one you need to monitor with this fungus growth in your grain is like the amount of air movement that you have through your grain bins. You wouldn't want to store it in a spot that you have no ventilation for your grain, because then you could have mold and other things that would get this fungi in there. And many of the grain bins today come with ventilation systems already in it to aid in that. So when storing your grain, you'd want to get a grain bin that has a good ventilation system to be able to keep a good stable amount of airflow through your grain bins while it's being stored.